nice guys are judging these bad boys as bad because they are what you are not. Now, of course, there are other bad boy traits that are at the extreme, like unable to handle their own emotions, a kind of machoism. It's typical toxic masculinity where they take affront to their honor and how dare you speak to me like that kind of thing, which could lead to physical abuse and verbal abuse. And that's largely coming out of a fear that the man has and his unaddressed core insecurities.
Welcome to the Masculine Psychology Podcast, where we answer key questions in relationships, attraction, success, and fulfillment. Now, here's your host, world-renowned therapist and life coach, David Tian.
Welcome to the Masculine Psychology Podcast. I'm David Tian, your host. In this episode, I'll be explaining the dual dynamic that determines whether there's chemistry in a long-term relationship or between two dating partners. If you're not aware of these dynamics, and if you don't learn how to handle them and grow out of them, then your relationship is doomed, no matter what. Even if the two of you stay together in the long run, I don't consider just staying together a successful marriage. Because if you just stay together, but there's no chemistry, there's no connection, there's no passion in the relationship anymore, well, I don't consider that to be successful. So this episode is building off the last episode, which was on sexual chemistry in a long-term relationship. And this is in response to a question from a listener. This is from Gershon Singh. And I'll read out the whole question. I answered the first half of it in the last episode. So this episode, we'll be diving into the second half of the question. Okay, so Gershon writes, lately I've been seeing a lot of women on the internet who are in committed marriages and relationships, but they're not attracted to their husbands. They say they have emotional intimacy, but no sexual intimacy. It seems to me like sexual attraction cannot be created, even if there is emotional intimacy. So I addressed that question in the last episode. Now we move on to the second half of the question for this episode. Another thing that I noticed is that women who have been in toxic relationships say that they have had the best sex of their lives. And when they get into healthy relationships, that should be in scare quotes, the sex is nothing compared to the toxic guy. It looks like good guys just can't have a woman desire them. Please give your thoughts, sir. So this was originally posted over a week ago. I've asked for more details from Gershon. Those details have not been forthcoming, so I don't actually know the context or the background for how he defines these labels of toxic relationship versus healthy relationship. What exactly is toxic or healthy here? I would not consider a healthy relationship one where the sex is not fulfilling or good. So already he's got an oxymoron there when he says, when they get into healthy relationships, the sex is nothing compared to the toxic guy. And in the last episode about sexual attraction, sexual intimacy, and emotional intimacy, I covered exactly why that would be the case. And if you think of yourself as a good guy, but your sex in your relationship is going stale, you definitely want to revisit the last episode, because I explain exactly what's going on there and how to fix that. And I'd have devoted 2 entire modules in my course, Rock Solid Relationships, to sex psychology, sex technique, and sexual energy. So based off the assumptions of good guy versus bad guy that are required to make this question make any sense, and based off my own experience working with nice guys for over a decade and formerly being one, I think what Gershon probably means by healthy relationship is one that's stable and secure with no drama. And a toxic relationship is one where there's lots of arguing and fighting and maybe some cheating, infidelity, that sort of thing. That's typically how immature people think of the difference between a healthy and a toxic relationship. And just as an aside, all psychotherapy treats arguments as actually very good in a healthy relationship if they lead to resolution of some kind where there's repair. Simply not arguing is not a sign of a healthy relationship. Maybe in the next episode I can dive deeper into why that's the case, but because Gershon hasn't elaborated even after a week, I've asked him to do so. Gershon, if you're listening, it's not too late to give me more details. I've asked for more details and background and so on. But I'm just going off of what I can based off of this one paragraph. But I think you're getting to an important point that I think a lot of nice guys who think of themselves as good guys get bitter and resentful when they see that the girls that they like, and I'm going to say the word girls because this is all really immature stuff, girls that they like go for the bad boys. And these nice guys are unable to access some of those attractive bad boy traits that I discussed in the last episode, like being adventurous or spontaneous or a risk taker or having fun and being in the moment and being present and being comfortable with their own sexuality. And instead, they bought into this knee-jerk kind of moral conservatism where sex is bad, obedience to authority is good, and what mommy and daddy and teachers and society say is good is therefore good. And so they need to be responsible and buttoned down and always on time and basically cannot be spontaneous, adventurous, fun-loving, happy-go-lucky, in the moment. And they need a woman to pull them out of that. And that's the beginning of the dual dynamic that I'm going to be spelling out here. But just first, before I dive into the dual dynamic, I want to point out, again, the moralistic judgmentalism against the so-called bad boy. And I've made other episodes on how there are no bad parts, taking that right from the title of Richard Schwartz's awesome book, No Bad Parts, which I highly recommend to everyone. You nice guys are judging these bad boys as bad because they are what you are not. Now, of course, there are other bad boy traits that are at the extreme, like unable to handle their own emotions, a kind of machoism. It's typical toxic masculinity where they take affront to their honor and how dare you speak to me like that kind of thing, which could lead to physical abuse and verbal abuse. And that's largely coming out of a fear that the man has and his unaddressed core insecurities. Just like the nice guy, he's got the same dynamic of core insecurities that are driving him into fear that he won't be enough or that he won't be loved, and that causes him to act in a way that is pleasing or tries to curry favor with the other person, trying to get their approval. And so they kiss ass. Basically, they try to please. That's their strategy. The bad boy is taking a rebel strategy, but they're both after the same thing. Both the bad boy and the so-called good guy or nice guy, both are after the same thing, which is to be loved and to be enough for love. They're just going after them in very different ways. Now, in my earlier dating coaching practice, I didn't meet many guys who, when they were children, took the rebel strategy. So there are generally three strategies when it came to, when you were a child, trying to get the attention, approval, love of your caregivers, your primary caregivers. The three main strategies were a pleaser, and a subset of a pleaser is the achiever, which is what the main strategy that I landed on. It's not always the case that achievers are pleasers, but often it is. So the pleaser is the one main strategy. Another main strategy is the recluse, the one who withdraws, a loner. Okay. And then the third strategy is to be a rebel. And sometimes an achiever can be a rebel, where it's sort of like a fuck you energy as he achieves. And generally speaking, I didn't see that many clients or students in my dating coaching practice who were rebels, because part of the rebel energy is exciting and sexy and daring and taboo. And that's already going to be built into it, sexually attractive naturally. Now, there are self-destructive tendencies that go along with the more extremes of that. And the longer you stay in just that dynamic of the rebel, the more it just evolves into a kind of chaos and a self-destruction. But it began with a way to get or to protect you from not being able to get the attention or the approval or the love or the connection that we so desperately craved when we were younger from our caregivers. So a little bit more empathy for the so-called bad boys. I know this is going to be impossible and probably will trigger a lot of these nice guys who might be listening. They call them Chads and they're right on their way to incel land if they're doing that. But what I've dedicated other episodes to is to explain that there are no bad parts, not only in yourself, but in other people. And what you might see on the surface and probably are judging is the evil there. And if those parts have been in this very destructive mode for a very long time, practically speaking, you probably do want to segregate them or take them out of the general population, right, for other people's protection and maybe for their own protection. But the assumption is they weren't born that way. They're not possessed by some eternally evil demon, but that they got to be that way through a trajectory, and they might have been genetically inclined towards addiction or aggression or something like that. But that when they were born, they were like all little babies who were craving for that connection, intimacy, love, attention, care, compassion, understanding, and to be seen and heard. Okay, so not only is this interesting from an intellectual perspective or from a psychoanalytic perspective, but it's also directly practical and relevant for nice guys and good guys. Because the first half of the dual dynamic, it's dual, so there are two dynamics here. The first dynamic is that we are unconsciously attracted to the parts of ourselves that we've disowned. And one of the reasons why bad boys are so sexually attractive to what you guys think, I'm speaking to the nice guy, I'm speaking to what I think Gershon might be like, though I would love to get more background on you, Gershon, and the context here. But I'm just going to go off of what I know of nice guys. And you'd only be feeling this and wondering this about a woman, girls, that you think are good girls, and you don't quite understand why good girls would be so sexually attracted to these bad boys. Well, here's the first dynamic. We will have sexual chemistry with people who present parts of themselves that resemble our own parts that we long ago disowned or exiled or tried to banish or cut away or kill off. And for so many responsible, mature people and kids growing up, they had to exile or ignore or banish those parts of themselves that were fun-loving, that were spontaneous, that would do crazy, weird, not normal things in order to avoid getting a scolding from mom or dad or the teacher, or in order to fit in. And now we're grown up, but we miss those parts of ourselves. But this is all happening unconsciously. We can't admit it to ourselves. And in fact, we disowned them, for most nice guys, so long ago that you don't even think that you ever were that way. And I did this episode of this podcast where I read out the dog story that illustrates how that could have happened. So I recommend you dig into that dog story as well, Gershon. And this also explains why, you've got the trope of opposites attract, or the, uptown girl going for the downtown boy, because those are the parts of ourselves that we've repressed, but that we're longing to reconnect with. So when we see them in someone else, if we can connect with them, they'll be able to draw out those parts. So it's like the promise of reunion for our own parts. Now, for me, my background growing up was a conservative, evangelical, also conservative Confucian Chinese boy growing up in a immigrant society where we didn't quite fit in fully for most of my 20 years in Canada. And this is a situation where my parents looked down on actively me dating any non-Chinese girls. And if any of you are the sons of Asian immigrant families, you know exactly what I mean, I think, if you're first or second generation immigrant. As well, part of that is the typical achiever's route of there were just a few professions that were approved, doctor, lawyer, engineer, that sort of thing. And anything outside that, it was frowned upon. My curfew all the way growing up, all the way until I graduated high school was 6 p.m. I had to be home by 6 p.m. If I wanted to stay out later than that, like catch a movie with my friends when I was like 17, I'd have to fill out a whole form that my parents created with emergency contact info and all this, and exactly where we will be, wherever we're going and when. And that had to be submitted 24 hours ahead. And I was the most controlled, most sheltered kid, definitely in my friends group growing up in suburban Toronto. I was so sheltered, in fact, that I wasn't even allowed to ride the subway until I was 16. And because I was so sheltered by that, my first time riding the subway alone, I was quite nervous about missing my stop, my station. And I was going to meet a friend who was also Asian Canadian, but he wasn't quite as so strictly monitored. And I kept getting out at intervals in the station and calling on the payphone, because we didn't have cell phones back then, my friend, to tell him, I'm at this station now. And he's like so annoyed by this. He's like, you do not need to do this. Just get there. But I also remember not being allowed to bicycle across it was 3 lanes each way, this major street near our house to get to the next neighborhood over. And this was the 6th or 7th grade. Even though I knew the green light meant that I could walk and there was plenty of time to get across, even if I were to walk my bike, I was just too frightened because I was conditioned with this fear of not breaking the rules, and the rule that was set was to not cross that road. Even though my friends always did this, and they basically just got frustrated with me, lost their patience, waiting for me on the other side, and then they just biked back and then didn't even talk to me and just took off. Now, I got so many more stories to drop for you to show how sheltered and how restrictive my upbringing was, and how good boy in that sense, obedient boy. In Chinese, we call it guai child, obedient, that I grew up with, such that it makes complete sense why, when I finally was able to, in my 30s, with the pickup skills and the focus on just having fun and hedonism, why I would be naturally attracted to women who were more on the wild side, who were unfettered, who had social freedom, who were in the moment. And I was not turned on by, or didn't have sexual chemistry with, women who were the straight-laced, responsible, intellectual types, because I already had those parts in lockdown. Those are my dominant parts. And I didn't need to have that energy. I wasn't looking to reconnect with that energy. And I've had many conversations with other dating coaches, pickup artists, who were given this choice of, it's almost like staring them in the face. Go with a safe, secure girl where they know there would be very little drama, or go with the wild, hot one. And if they go with their feelings, they go with the hot one. And then they get the drama. Now, hot, I shouldn't have used that word, because that makes it sound like she wasn't physically attractive. For those who have had more abundance of dating experiences, you might have gotten to the point where you have started dating a woman, or going on dates with a woman who is physically or sexually attractive, but with whom you just don't have chemistry. You might not even be able to get it up with her. And it's just mind-boggling to you, because you're thinking to yourself, this person is sexually attractive. Why isn't this happening? And she might be offended. She often is, because she thinks it's some kind of judgment on her that you don't think she's hot enough. And the thing is, you probably have a really good friendship. You'd make good friends. Like, she's like a buddy. And you're just missing the sexual chemistry there, because you have a stable, relatively stable relationship, like friendship, like you guys are just friends. And this is part of what's happening here in the unconscious. This is the first dynamic that you need to know about, that we all have chemistry with those who resemble the parts of ourselves that we've disowned or exiled or banished or repressed. Those all basically mean the same thing. They're all getting at the same thing.
No matter their physical strength, for many men, emotions are too much for them to handle. It's why they can't give women the deeper levels of emotional intimacy and connection that they crave. It's why they fail to be the man that modern women desire most. A man with inner strength. A man who has mastered his emotions. Find out how to master your emotions through David Tian's Emotional Mastery Program. The Emotional Mastery Program is a step-by-step system that integrates the best of empirically verified psychotherapy methods and reveals how to master your internal state and develop the inner strength that makes you naturally attractive, happy, and fulfilled. Learn more about this transformational program by going to davidtianphd.com/emotional mastery. That's DAVIDTIANPHD.com/emotional mastery.
If any of you can remember the heyday of the PUA world, the pickup artist world, in the mid-2000s to late 2000s, there was a TV show that ran for 2 seasons. I think it was MTV or VH1, and it was Mystery, the PUA, and it was a reality show. I don't know how many they started with, 15 guys, and they winnowed it down to the one guy who would win, and they had these series of challenges. And the final challenge was always having to do with strippers. And no one ever psychoanalyzed this back then, or at least I didn't come across anything. But it just seems so blatantly obvious now why these sheltered nerds would idealize the stripper, because the stripper is the opposite of the nerd who was sheltered and had to stay at home doing his homework and all of that, because she's the wild one. She's the one who's taking these huge risks, and she's the seductive one. Her job literally is to seduce men out of their money without giving up anything further. So that's why this very toxic relationship or dynamic between sheltered nice guys who are trying to compensate for their insecurities by adopting narcissistic patterns, I'm writing a whole book on how this came about, would so highly idealize strippers who were toxic, in their own way, generally speaking. But there is this chemistry between them, because in that sense, the opposites attract, because they represent for each other parts of themselves they've disowned. Now, all of the other stuff needs to be there, right? So if you don't have baseline physical attractiveness, right? So if you're obese, let's say, it's generally better and be more attractive for you if you got fit. If you've got a lot of pimples or zits, it would generally be more attractive for you if you got to a dermatologist and got that handled, right? This is just obvious stuff, right? So just take care of your makeover as far as you can take it. And there are tons of resources. I mean, there are multi-billion-dollar industries around this, including getting a fashion stylist. Many huge department stores, the biggest department stores, will have free fashion stylists because when they give you the recommendations, they're recommending clothes in the store. And if you've never done that, gotten a fashion makeover with a professional, I highly recommend you do that, especially getting your color schemes and all that worked out for you. And that's pretty straightforward. I'm talking about a much deeper level. Why, even when two people can find each other physically attractive, almost like admiring a statue or a sculpture in a museum, like, yes, this is physically attractive, and yet there isn't any sexual chemistry. There might be friendship, right, and connection, but there's no sexual chemistry where the butterflies in the stomach and the sex is hot and all that. That will require an even deeper, much deeper unconscious dual dynamic. And the first half of this dynamic, the first dynamic, is the disowned parts. So first, there's the fact that we are attracted to the parts of ourselves that we've disowned. Now, an even more common dynamic, and one that I think Gershon might be falling into, because it's probably not some uptown girl that you're dealing with who's falling for some downtown boy kind of bad boy. It might be an executive bad boy, so he's an uptown bad boy. But more likely, given your assumptions in this question to make it work and the kind of sexual immaturity that it's displaying, I'm just being frank, and I addressed that in the last episode. The disowned parts dynamic that many nice guys fall under is what I'd call the manic fairy dream girl. And this is first noticed by film critics in analyzing very popular films that show this dynamic between the sheltered, nerdy nice guy or geeky nice guy, and the manic, what they call manic pixie dream girl. And I've devoted an entire episode of the Man Up podcast years ago to this dynamic. So I highly recommend that you dig into that. I'll have to make a note to include a link to that in my notes for the manic fairy dream girl episode. It's definitely worth it for you to dive deeper into this if any of this holds true for you. But very quickly, just for this episode, the manic fairy dream girl to a sheltered nice guy here's the sheltered nice guy who leads a pretty mundane life on his own. He's got a stable job. It's going through the motions. He doesn't really feel alive. And of course, that would happen if you've exiled the spontaneous, fun-loving parts of yourself. And he runs into a woman who has disowned the parts that he resembles, the sort of responsible, button-down, follow society, fit in kind of parts. And she's gone the other way, and she's probably got dyed hair, and she's spontaneous and out of the ordinary, out of the box. And she gets him out of his shell, and he feels alive when he's with her. And this is the course of many movies like 500 Days of Summer, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And in the movie, in the story, in real life, she takes him through these fun adventures and spontaneous times where she's bringing him out of his shell, and he feels more alive with her than he ever has before. She brings out these parts of him, and he finally feels whole. But then she begins to feel empty because she's just giving. He's just taking. And often there's this sort of manic, depressive nature to a manic fairy dream girl because reality starts to set in. And that's when the second dynamic, the unfinished business dynamic, kicks in. And then that's where the relationship dissolves and the sheltered, nice guy nerd is left again as if his life has no meaning. It's mundane, it's gray, it's had all of the color sucked out of it because he actually didn't do the work that relationship opened up the gateway and the possibility for, which was a reunion with those parts of himself that he's disowned. There's this great line in Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind where Kate Winslet's character says, "Too many guys think I'm a concept, or I complete them, or I'm going to make them alive. But I'm just a fucked up girl who's looking for my own peace of mind. Don't assign me yours." So if you want to know why these good girls are always going for these bad boys, it's because there are parts of themselves that they have repressed, denied, disowned, exiled, cut out, banished, and that they're unconsciously trying to reconnect with. And those bad boys represent these parts. Now, that's not enough to create chemistry, but that is a necessary component for it. Chemistry, sexually, and in the long run, this will then devolve or move into, I should say, the next dynamic of unfinished business. Now, those disowned parts of you are the leftover. They're the collateral damage for the protector parts that rose up to be sort of managing your day-to-day life. So for the achiever, collateral damage might be the parts of him that are spontaneous and fun-loving or sexual or sort of innocent play and playfulness. So in order to hunker down and do 3 hours of homework when he was, 10 years old, by 5 or 6 or 7, he had already started to excise those parts of himself that needed to have lots of playtime. So at the beginning, you'll be attracted to those parts of you that you've disowned in the other person. But over time, you will do to the other person's parts what you've done to your own disowned parts, which is to disown them, to try to control them, repress them, get rid of them. So here's a dynamic that's quite normal between a nerdy, sheltered, nice guy and the wild girl that he dates, the manic fairy dream girl, or even the stripper type of energy, is that he's going to try to control her to become what he became: mature, responsible, independent, go get a job and make something of yourself, which is what he did. And he's basically unconsciously pressuring her parts to fit in with his parts, because that's the dynamic that he knows, and that's exactly what happened. And then what happens is the unfinished business comes up. So the unfinished business is the other side of the equation. So the disowned parts are you and what happened for you. The unfinished business is your relation to the caregiver. And this is where all that Freudian and all the psychoanalytic stuff really comes into play and is most obvious in longer term relationships past the honeymoon period. Because in the honeymoon period, you have this disowned parts stuff going on. And then you have a devaluation of those very same disowned parts. And then what comes to the fore is trying to get this unfinished business resolved. Now, even at the very beginning, there has to be the promise that this person could be somebody that you could work out your unfinished business with. Now, what do I mean by unfinished business? So let's look at these disowned parts. When you were playful, as an example, when you were playful and your mother scolded you because you started throwing things around, or maybe you made a big mess and she didn't like that. And as a result, you started to suppress the more wild play parts of you. And eventually, if she kept doing that, she conditioned, in order for you to get her love and attention and care and all that stuff, in order for you to get to her approval, for her to accept you, you had to push down those parts of you that she didn't approve of. And your whole system, both the parts of you that ended up getting exiled as a result, and the parts of you that had to step up to protect those very parts, to adapt, to get and keep that love, connection, care, attention, approval of those that you wanted most desperately to have the love. And in fact, were very dependent on when you were a young child, your primary caregivers. All of your parts are hoping to redo this whole dynamic, to finish this business with mom or dad, or whoever your primary caregivers were. So here's an example of how these two dynamics come into play. The sheltered nerd wouldn't just be attracted to the stripper, who is the wild, fun-loving, spontaneous, in-the-moment, playful person. There should also be the sort of subtext or this underlying potential or promise that she could be as dramatic and as angry and rageful and as strict and as controlling as his mother was, as an example, assuming that that was your dynamic. And everyone who's listening to this will have their own unique dynamic coming out of your own background. But what's happening here is you're going to need to have both to experience the greatest chemistry. So if this sheltered nerd met a wild, playful, adventurous, spontaneous stripper, let's say, but she never shows anger, she never shows impatience, she never shows she tries to control. Maybe instead she's just working at charities on her off time and is taking care of shelter animals in her home, right? And she's utterly patient, right? So this sort of saint of a stripper. This would fail to create the fullness of the chemistry that would trigger the greatest idealization from the sheltered nerd. So there's two aspects here. And the unfinished business dynamic really comes up after the honeymoon period in the relationship is over. So you're looking at somewhere around 6 months to 3 years, it really starts to come up, and it builds in intensity. as you get more and more intimate with each other. Because what's happening when you get intimate is that those parts of you that are desperate to get back the love, attention, approval of your primary caregivers from when you were 3 years old or earlier or 5 or whatever, they're getting more and more desperate over time. And this is where that kind of testing dynamic, this is the only place where that testing dynamic really makes sense. Along the way, there are some manipulative women who might test you, but the best thing you can do is to not even bother going through these tests with them, not even thinking about it. Not just so you can track them. Why would you attract a woman who's manipulative? Unless you, of course, you can have chemistry with somebody like that because you are naive, right? But here you have sincere tests because you're testing whether the other person will do to you and your parts what your primary caregivers did to them way long ago when you were 3 or 5 or whatever. Because that's actually what the whole relationship is about. Because what they're trying to do, why it feels so good to finally be in love in this way, is because finally these parts of you, these childlike parts that were disowned back then as collateral damage for having to adjust and adapt to get your primary caregiver's approval, they're finally accepted and loved and cherished for who they are. And in order to do that, you've got to come out and push. You've got to really test things because you can't believe it because it's so scary that that might be the case. And this unfinished business will sink almost every couple because they'll get triggered and back into their childlike parts. And that will trigger all of the other protectors and what IFS will call firefighters that just go into more extreme behaviors. And that will trigger the other person. And then they go to their firefighters and the exiles are completely lost in they're, again, collateral damage in the whole thing. And so it feels like a re-wounding, which is why when there's a breakup or a divorce, often it feels like you're being torn apart and your whole life is meaningless because it's bringing up back when you were a defenseless child, what it was like to have to kill off parts of yourself or to exile, lock up in the basement or banish parts of yourself, repressed now for decades, very likely. And they come out in the promise of an intimate relationship where they get to have a do-over with this partner who now is the stand-in for the primary caregivers. Now, it gets even more complicated because, generally speaking, most people have more than one primary caregiver. And so there's an even more complex dynamic. And this is why psychotherapy is something that you need to train in. And it's a lot more complicated and sophisticated than what we can cover in a simple half-hour podcast episode. But this dual dynamic is there. That's the basis of the whole thing, of all of this sexual chemistry, of the chemistry in an intimate relationship. Now, the unfinished business stuff is actually even deeper, as you might have picked up, and it's the basis of entire schools of psychotherapy and couples counseling that have tons of empirical evidence behind them. And I've devoted an entire 4-video masterclass for free that I'm offering on my davidtianphd.com website. You can get access to this free masterclass on this very thing, and I've entitled that masterclass, The Secret of a Successful Relationship. And I go over the science and how it works of this second dynamic of the unfinished business, the unresolved issues. Now, if you're already in my mailing list, you already should have access because we just automatically give access to everyone in the mailing list to our suite of masterclasses. There are over 13 masterclasses. This is one of those masterclasses. It's a 4-video series. I put the first video of this 4-video series on my YouTube, and I entitled it, Is Love Enough? Why Passionate Love Becomes Toxic. That seminar was filmed and uploaded over 4 years ago, so you probably need to search for it. It's under, the easiest way to find it is under our playlist. There's a playlist I entitled Keynotes, Talks, and Interviews. You can find it listed there, Is Love Enough? Or you can just opt in at my website and go to the masterclass, the free masterclass called Secret of a Successful Relationship. If you don't, at the very bare minimum, understand these two dynamics of the disowned parts and the unfinished business, you will be completely lost and just completely reactive and triggered, and you will experience the worst breakups if the relationship is actually intimate and you actually have chemistry when you start. That's why it looks from the outside like it's toxic. And you might think the bad boy who's cheating on her and all this, it's his fault. He's the bad guy. Well, actually, they're both at fault. And if you're interested, I'm thinking about devoting the next episode to unpacking that. for the stereotypical bad boy that a lot of the nice guys hate. And I'm going to choose one that's a little bit more realistic because you're probably not competing, if you're a nice guy, with Hell's Angels or like gangsters or anything like that, criminals with tattoos on their necks. Probably not competing with guys like that, but probably more of an executive type of bad boy who cheats on her. So I'm going to give that example. Think about giving that example as an episode and diving into that as a case study for the next episode. So let me know if you're interested in that. This unfinished business is actually quite deep, and I give lots of examples in that 4-video masterclass. It's free on my website. You can go to davidtianphd.com and opt into it, and you get access to it. I also have the first video up on YouTube. This dynamic, the dual dynamic of the disowned parts and the unfinished business, is explained in great detail by Richard Schwartz, the founder of IFS Therapy, in his book, You Are the One You've Been Waiting For. And he explains it in the section on the tormentor, where your intimate partner is tormenting you, but also your mentor, because they're giving you this opportunity to connect with those disowned parts of yourself and for you to access your true self. And only your true self can resolve the unfinished business for you. Only you can resolve your unfinished business for you. But the other person gives you the opportunity by triggering you in this way. So what often looks toxic to the untrained eye is actually an opportunity, a window of opportunity to grow up. So take advantage of those resources, the Man Up episode on the Manic Fairy Dream Girl, the 4-video masterclass on the secret to a successful relationship on the unfinished business. Study Richard Schwartz's excellent book, You Are the One You've Been Waiting For, on the tormentor concept. Because the other way that this could go is that you find somebody who is secure and stable and you have a safe relationship with them. But because you haven't triggered these dual dynamics, there's no chemistry. And that's what Gershon's probably referring to there, where these so-called good girls are finding that they don't have much sexual chemistry with the safe options, and that they're only sexually triggered in a good way. They only have chemistry with these bad boys. Well, the reason is because they trigger each other in just the right ways to create that chemistry. But then that is not going to last unless they do the work of the therapeutic process. And the therapeutic process is the same thing here, whether it's just on your own or in a relationship. Being in a relationship gives you an opportunity to accelerate the whole therapeutic process and go much deeper than you could on your own. And that's the whole tormentor concept that Richard Schwartz explains. Because here you have an opportunity to much more quickly see and connect with your disowned parts, because they are represented in the surface parts of your partner, as well as understanding your unfinished business. And that's really the hard part. That takes a lot of sticking with itness and courage. And I probably will go into more depth on it in a future episode. And if that's something that interests you, maybe I can do it in the next episode. Thanks so much for listening. If you have any feedback whatsoever, please leave a comment. Let me know what you thought of the episode. And if this helped you in any way, please share it with anyone else that you think could benefit from it. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to welcoming you to the next episode. Until then, David Tian signing out.